All systems go. Clear for liftoff.
Welcome on in, golf fans. It's your boy GS Luke here with our round 3 showdown stream for the BMW Championship. Going to get you guys ready to build all of your lineups with a look at the weather report, some strategy for Saturday. We'll go through the shots gained metrics and building a player pool, as well as building a lineup together to kind of tie it all together, and any questions that you've got for me in the chat. So whether it's a process-based question, a player you want me to deep dive a little bit later on, don't be shy at all about letting me know, and let's have ourselves a moving day for this event. And today, a lot of the chalk hit, so I didn't really have the best day, and that's just going to be the case. You're not going to see me playing a lot of those higher owned options, but for main slate purposes, really riding hot over the first few days. So we'll see if that holds up over the last 36 holes, and want to get back after it for showdown tomorrow. So that's our goal here. Going to give you guys the goods for Saturday. And like I said, anything that you're curious about in particular, just feel free to go ahead and let me know. But it started off with the golf course, which played pretty flat between the quote unquote waves, but there's continuous tee times. There's only 49 players. So it's not like we had a massive spread, but it did play 0.18 shots easier in the first half of tee time. So that tells us that the golf course may have dried out a little bit. They had that dousing of rain on Thursday afternoon, about a half an inch that hit the golf course. So we expected it to be a little bit easier today, and that was reflected with the overall scoring average. But as the day went on, it dried out a little bit more and more. So for round number 3, I think that trend's going to continue. The morning guys might have slightly more receptive conditions to attack. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but the weather looks pretty flat as well. But the PM guys, they might have slightly firmer greens to attack, but they're also the best players in the field, the guys that are in better form this week. And in most cases, like your world top 5, top 10 are finding themselves in the top 25 at this stage. That difference in talent level and form probably makes up for that kind of a conditions difference. So I think when we take a look at the round 3 stats, that it's going to be pretty even across the board, and might even actually favor the later guys, but I don't think it'll be because of the conditions, more so because they're more engaged. They're not going to be as aggressive. I mean, your guys at the bottom end of the board that have nothing to lose, that may have to move into the top 10, top 20 to have any chance of getting into the top 30, you know, for at least for Eastlake, they're going to have to go for every single green. They're going to have to try and drive 11 like you saw players doing in a lot of cases this afternoon. The players that were laying up were your Ricky Fowlers that are right on that 30 line, your Taylor Pendriths that weren't as aggressive. The players that were going for it pretty much no matter what were your Johnny Vegases of the world. So I think you're going to see some volatile scores from some of the players in the camp of, you know, the outside looking in, and the players that are towards the top that have a more firm position on that top 30. I think you're going to see play more consistent golf compared to those early guys. And that's not to say that you should only be playing the later starters, because you're going to need some medium to maybe even some early guys for leverage purposes. But I do project them a little bit later than some of the earlier players. So when you take a look at the weather forecast, it looks extremely flat, as I was mentioning before. Sub 7 miles an hour of sustained wind the entire day. Your wind gusts do look a little bit more significant in the afternoon. They're closer to like 4 to 5 miles an hour in the morning. In the afternoon, close to like 7, 8, maybe 9 miles an hour, but not a big difference between the morning and the afternoon. So that's why I think that it's going to be pretty flat overall. And whether tee times, that kind of thing for Saturday, probably not the biggest influence on my personal exposure, but will have a big exposure and a big influence on that is going to be the ownership, which is exactly what we're about to go through. And we're going to go through the top 10 in ownership for tomorrow. So these are reflective of my projections from my Patreon page, and maybe not exactly what's going to be on the SHIPIT Nation side, but what I'm going to show you guys here is what we were talking about yesterday, where the top end of the board, the players that have played well so far, are going to be the most popular options on the slate. And you can see that on the left there, Robert McIntyre in the 7K range is by far the highest owned out of all of those guys. And I would say the 18.7% that I have him at might even be a little bit conservative. I think in single entries, you're looking at over 20% for a Bobby Mack. And, you know, Scotty Scheffler at -9, he's always going to get some attention. But your other 10K options that are getting especially steamed up, an O'Bear, who's at -8 towards the top, a Tommy Fleetwood, who's been stellar through the first 36 holes as well. It's rather predictable. So your Harry Hulls, your Rory McIlroys are popping a little bit extra because of that current score. And there will be a few exceptions, like a Cam Young getting played because he's the best option at the bottom end of that 9K. Not a lot of guys around him that are playing well. And if you look at the recent form, he's got the best form there. So there's always going to be the oddball outlier that we end up getting. But for the most part, it's the guys starting in that top 10. So for round 4 showdown, you could say that's warranted because of the placement points. But for rounds 2 and 3 showdown, it's the same thing as what we had for Friday's slate. There's no incentive for taking guys starting in the top 10 other than the fact that they're playing better golf, which is something that you have to incorporate. But oftentimes the ownership, and it's 2 to 3 times the ownership of some of the other players around them, is just way overblown, right? It's, if it was like a 1 to maybe 1.5% difference on ownership on these players, then for sure you'd want to play the chalkier ones. But in large field GPPs where we're trying to play against the rest of the field, that's why it's so important to have ownership projections like this, the ones on the SHIPIT Nation website as well, that are accurate and can give you a pretty good idea of where the field is coming in. So those are the top 10 highest owned players. Towards the fringe, there's a lot of guys in that 15 to 18% range. So these guys towards the bottom are pretty interchangeable with maybe the next tier down. But these guys at the top are going to be by far the highest owned players on the slate. So not to say that you have to fade every single one. In fact, I think there's like 3, maybe 4 players of this top 10 that I'm still using in lineups. But a lot of them I am taking a stance against the rest of the field on. Just if you're going to use them, be cognizant of that with the rest of your lineup construction. The next thing I want to note before we start going through shots gained metrics would be my player pool tags. And anytime we go through the shots gained metrics, that is one part of building your player pool. But I always talk about some of the other things that you want to incorporate on top of that, especially to find some of your sleeper plays. And I'm very, cutthroat on what I use to find my plays. It pretty much does not change for every single slate. It's one of these 4 categories. You've got the ball striking popper, short game regression candidates. That's going to be what we go through with the shots gained metrics. But we have high birdie percentage players. Those are guys that make a whole lot of birdies, which correlates directly to the DraftKings scoring. Those are really big in my round 2 and 3 process. Even round 4, it still matters. The birdie production is even more so important than that placement points that you're going to add on top of that. But also players with good course history. And this week, I'm not really using this one as much because we only played here in 2021 and this course has been renovated since the last time that we've been there. But these other 3 categories are what I'm really leaning on to make my plays. So it's not just the shots gained metrics. Sometimes I'm looking for players I could just post a really good DraftKings score. And it doesn't just have to be limited to these 3 options for yourself. You can look at bent grass putters. That's something that I include on my DFS sheet for my research purposes. You could use some of the best bent grass putters. That's very reasonable at a putting heavy golf course. You could do the best projected fantasy point plays. Like you can make up whatever sort of tag you want to get to your plays. And some are going to be better than others. And some are going to be more effective for you than others. You got to kind of tinker around with it and figure out what's going to work the best for you. But the key is, and this is the thing that you have to do, in my opinion, for your process, is have it clear cut and written out. Have an exact idea for why you're getting to your plays so that you can improve that process over time. You can figure out what's working for you and what's not working. And so you can evaluate after the fact whether you're getting onto plays that really made sense. So that's my 2 cents on your player pool and actually choosing your options for the next day. Now let's take a look at the shots gained metrics and show you what that exactly looks like. So let me get to the right tab over here. We'll go over to bet the number and we're going to go through some of these round 2 ball striking poppers. So let's see if there's any of you guys in chat. We got rushing yard down there with the Fowler clutch. What's going on, Sites? What's going on, Daniel, as well? You're in first in the 50K birdie. That's a good spot to be in by 22 points. Heck of a good run out so far. So best of luck there. He said, with such condensed ownership at the top, how big of a stand do you need? I think it depends on how many lineups you're entering, Sites, because usually that 2 to 2.5x leverage is what we're hoping for. But if you're only entering 20 lineups, then you might want to be getting closer to 3x leverage on a lot of those sort of players. So 150 lineups, I think 2 to 2.5x is a good mark. Even on a slate like this, you might be slightly more aggressive. So that's why I give the 2.5x number. But yeah, 20 max or even, smaller than that, you want to be real aggressive when there's only 49 players to choose from. You're looking at Goddard. I am as well. He's actually in my player pool already. I like his ball striking stats. And any sort of player pool deep dives that you've got, feel free to let me know. And yeah, we have Goku in the chat as well. And don't feel bad at all for being late, man. Better to have you late than never. Hopefully you're having a fantastic day. But let's talk through the top ball striking poppers. So that's what we have the sorted by and bet the number. Number 1, Ludwig Ober, Robbie McIntyre at number 2, Michael Kim, Scotty Scheffler, Akshay Bhatia rounding out that top 5. All of these guys are going to get some steam in DFS because of this, but it's mostly like the top 5 that are really going to get that extra steam. And it's not just the fact that they're starting at the top end of the board, but also because they're the guys that are hitting the ball the best. And it's not like some, secret out there to go out there and look for shots gained approach and shots gained off the tee. It's probably the most well-known thing about golf handicapping is that you want guys that can do it in that sustainable fashion and that putting. I mean, everyone, that really looks at golf and has looked at it for any sort of, long period of time knows that putting can be extremely variant from day to day. So that's why we look at these ball striking poppers, and you're not going to be the only one doing so. But when we get to the Akshay Bhatias of the world or the Chris Gotterups down here, he gained 1.5 shots gained himself, and he's T34 at +3. Those sort of options that aren't going to be nearly as popular are, in my opinion, very intriguing for this sort of slate. And the thing that they give you that some of these other players don't is a low ownership number. Average to below average ownership on Akshay, Chris Gotterup, I've got him below 10% projected owned in my projections. And the chalky guys around them are 15 to 20% owned. So, if you can take somebody at half the ownership that still projects well from the ball striking standpoint, in both cases, you can see Akshay lost strokes in the short game categories. That's the around the green and the putting. And that is something that can normally turn around rather quickly. Chris Gotterup, the same thing. He lost around the green, also 1.3 strokes with the putter. Those are the sort of players that I'm using for bounce backs. So both in my player pool, both for really the same kind of reason. And you can still use some of the chalky guys towards the top, but they're not my favorite, like low on diamond of the roughs that I'm getting to for this kind of a slate. So shout out to Jacob Bridgman. His stat profile looks pretty good. Taylor Pendrith, I would say the same thing about. And the thing about those kind of guys I like is that they're not at the very top end of the board. Who else? Daniel Berger, he stands out. And look at that. He gained strokes putting for like the first time in a few tournaments. So not quite the two or three strokes into the positive that we want. That's what we need for him to shoot like -5, -6. But he's trending in the right direction after losing like 3 strokes in round number 1. But these are the sort of poppers that I'm looking for from the ball striking side. And then with the short game stats, I want to look at the poppers and the players that didn't perform as well. The poppers are players that I raised a little bit of a red flag against. So these guys that gained over 3 strokes putting today, it is very difficult to do that in back-to-back rounds. So for example, a Mavi was over 4 strokes, a Cantlay, a Deki Matsuyama, a Cam Young, even with those 2.7 strokes right there, are players that I'd expect to be closer to a neutral tomorrow. And that's not to say that they can't still gain like a stroke and a half to the field, but to have a nuclear performance, a spike round like we're hoping for from the DFS streets, we need that sort of a putting performance. So, a lot of times these players are fades for me because the other thing that coincides with them gaining 3 or 4 strokes putting is they had one of the best rounds of the day. And that usually means the ownership's going to be higher than a lot of the other players around them. So give me a ball striking popper over somebody that was really short game dependent. And it's not just this putting. So we can look at the around the green as well. Look at that. Hideki also gained 2 around the green. But if we sort it by that category, these guys that are heavily into the dark green, you don't want to give them too much credit for chipping in or, for getting up and down every time that they missed a green. And while that's good for main slate, it's good for like placement bets, actually, winning golf tournaments. It's not great for DraftKings scoring. DraftKings scoring is much more about the birdies that you can post, which is about the ball striking, setting up birdie looks in that 5 to 10 foot range, and then, trying to make your fair share of them on the greens as well. So that's usually what I'm trying to optimize for my showdown lineups, which is why I'm so focused on those 2 categories as opposed to this around the green and the putting, which means players that lost a whole bunch of strokes in these categories, but showed us some life in the ball striking stats, are also players that I'll give a little bit of grace to. They're the kind of guys that I'll forgive, I'll use for a bounce back on the next round. So Morikawa, for example, horrible round. I mean, he lost 5 strokes to the field today, dog shit stuff. But he was neutral with the ball striking, which really isn't that bad. I mean, he wasn't great either. Let's not give him too much credit there. But he lost all of his strokes around the green and putting. And Colin Morikawa can be a bit of a nutcase. He's not always the most consistent players in those 2 categories. But even if he's just a neutral to the field there, and then he gains his trademarked 1.5 to 2 strokes with the ball striking stats, that could be a pretty solid round for Colin. And there's always the upside that he flips it in the opposite direction, goes from like losing just under 5 strokes to the field short game to maybe gaining 2 or 3 strokes to the positive. That would be a massive swing and potentially even a ceiling round for Colin. So, you could look at that potential play. Like Sungjae Im, his irons were terrible today, but it was mostly the short game that really held him from doing anything positive. Bud Cauley, it's not like he had a great ball striking day. In fact, he lost about 0.8 strokes to the field, but it was mostly short game that really led him into shooting an over par round. Those are the kind of players that I'll be looking at too. And shout out to Siwoo Kim. Maybe he regresses a little bit on the greens as well. Jason Day, I guess I'll shout him out as a potential short game regression candidate. Chris Gotterup kind of shows up on this category too. And then same thing with Akshay Bhatia. And maybe they're not as extreme examples as some of the other players that we've shown, but that matters as well, right? It's not just about the top end ball striking list like we were bringing up before. That's why we scrolled down a little bit and tried to find guys that were a little bit sneakier. And, speaking of, I guess I'll give you guys a few more of the sneaky ball strikers. Keep an eye out for a Nick Taylor. Not really a golf course that fits his game well, but he's really been hitting it well over the first few days. A few other players that stand out would maybe be a Shane Lowry. He does fit these hard, grinded out style golf courses. I know it played a little bit easier today, but in general, this course is more difficult than some of the ones that they've been playing recently. I guess a D Berger, shout that out. He's towards the top end of the leaderboard ball striking wise, maybe not getting as much out of the game as you'd expect with the short game. Don't sleep on some of the guys that aren't just at the very top of those lists as well. And like I said, don't sleep on course history, high upside players, some of those other reasons that you're getting to your player pool. And the reason for that is if you're only looking at the round 2 stats, is that you're going to be playing a lot of medium to high owned players. The short game regression candidates, sometimes you can find some diamonds in the rough that are like sub 10% owned. They can Akshay, Chris Gotterup, like I was mentioning a little bit earlier. But a lot of times you're taking guys that are average to above average ownership. So if you're really, really trying to get into the weeds and find those a lot of times on a showdown slate, it'd be sub 5%ers, but there's only 49 players. So more realistically, like sub 10%ers that you're mixing in on your showdown lineups, you're going to have to be a little bit more creative about it. So that's why having a more well-rounded process is so key. And because it's such a variant sport, one day's results for golf should not be taken like it's the gospel. It's, just one piece of the puzzle that you should be incorporating. The main one for me that I use for my projections would be their last 24 rounds heading in. Even if you want to take a look at the full event stuff, I think that's a little bit better than just only looking at the day before. That's why you want to be a little bit more well-rounded with what you guys are incorporating. So let's see if there's any player pool deep dives that we need to do. And then afterwards, we're going to wrap it up with building a lineup together and kind of tying it all together at the same time. He said, are we doing this stream through the swing season? Yeah, I believe so, Sites. I'm going to have to check with Hoop and Tambo on whether they need those live streams. But yeah, whether it's on this live stream or it's on my YouTube channel, I will be doing them. Just depends on where at this point. So yeah, the shows will be on there. I'll let you guys know exactly where. He said, nice call on Tommy finger popping his butthole today. You faded and that worked out nicely. Yeah, that's a Tommy lad for you, man. He's what is he? -6. He made all those strokes putting in the first round. I would say round 3, though, heading into moving day, I said that's the spot to maybe deploy him after he has an average round. It could be the spot, Ross. So don't sleep on him for the next day. And let's look at the shots gained metrics, I guess, just to show you what that looks like. And gained off the tee, gained on approach, and then lost in the short game categories. I mean, it's exactly what I thought would happen, right? I thought he would just fall from the heavens a bit, which happens to pretty much everyone, I guess, except for Robert McIntyre, who putted over his ass in round 1 and also had a pretty good putting round today. I think he's probably the main outlier that was able to sustain that over both rounds. I guess the Scotty Scheffler as well, right? He had a really good putting day on Thursday. Today, it was only a stroke gain to the field, so it was much more modest. Even a McIntyre, it was only 1.2 strokes gained to the field, so it's not like he was nearly as effective as what he was for the first day, but that happens almost every single time. So, remember the names Hideki, Mav McNeely, Harry Hall. It's very unlikely that they're going to do it the same way. If they get there, it's going to be the McIntyre method, right? After the nuclear putting day, just hit everything to 5 to 10 feet. Then you can still have yourself around the next time around. He said, what do I think about the donkey chalk Kurt Kitayama? Yeah, Kurt Kitayama, and normally the donkey chalk that just hardly makes the cuts is the chalk that goes off per my guy DGen75. That was something that he would always say on the live streams for round 3. And a lot of truth to that, right? And I think there's a logical reason for why there was a lot of truth to that is because those players were chalk for a reason. I mean, the PGA DFS community has gotten a lot sharper over the last 5 years or so at identifying some of the best plays. And a lot of the guys that check all the boxes for people are chalk for a reason. And that was Kurt Kitayama here. It's a good course fit, and he had some of the best history. Not some of the best history, some of the best form heading into this event. That matters. So Kurt Kitayama, I think he could go off for round 3 just because I think he models and projects well compared to a lot of the other players around him. That's the main reason that I think he's got a shot for round number 3. But yeah, man, that narrative, whether it's just a narrative or even if there's some facts behind it, I think it's more so the talent level of those guys, right? There's reasons why a lot of players end up chalking PGA DFS, and over the years, it's become even more educated, I would say. Let's go through some lineup construction, though, and wrap this thing up. So in terms of lineup construction, we want to make sure we have enough leverage in our lineups. And kind of like yesterday, you can't go too overboard with it because there's not placement points. It's not like a main slate where the cream's going to rise to the top over 4 rounds. Sometimes we get some wacky shit that happens on Showdown. And in fact, I play, and this is my strategy with Scotty, is I play him on main slate, then I almost always fade him on Showdown until round 4. And then a lot of times I'll play him for my round 4 Showdown lineups. But that kind of strategy in general, where I'm just like fading the guys that are like the obvious high-owned plays, is almost always what I do for Showdown, regardless of who's the chalk and how it really sets up, because there's a lot more chaos and a lot more volatility on just an 18-hole sample size of golf than when you have those 72 holes for the quote-unquote cream to rise to the top, as I said before. So up top, a lot of people are going to be tempted to play your Scotties, your Tommy Fleetwoods, even after the kind of sketchy round. His ownership is well above the average. A Ludwig Gobert, he's also going to be some of the chalkier options towards the top. I like myself some Xander, though. Like a Xander Schauffele didn't have the best day or anything like that, but his ball striking, especially on his back 9, was half decent. It was into the positive in both categories, and then he lost short game. So, you know, I'm willing to take a shot on these guys that are some of the best players in the world. I mean, Xander, a top 3 player in terms of official world golf ranking. So it's not like we're going out on that much of a limb here. And at $10,100, he's one of the few players towards the top end of the board that is going to be closer to 10% owned rather than 20 to 25%, like some of his other counterparts. So, you know, let's punt the ownership a bit and go with Xander at the top end of the board as opposed to maybe a slightly chalkier option. Let's go JT as our second man in, and I am kind of giving away some of my sleeper plays here by doing this, but I guess that's okay. We can do that with at least a few of these players here. JT, though, a high upside guy, is number 1 on tour in birdie or better percentage, so that kind of speaks for itself on that one. All right, $7,500 remaining for our last few spots, and we've got 2 pivots in there already, and I know they're at the top end of the board, but a pivot is a pivot pretty much no matter where you're mixing it in. And the reason for that, even more so this week than most, a lot of times the 6K range is like all sub 5 percenters. Not the case at this event. It is much more spread out. The same dynamic where it's like almost even across the board with the distribution of players is again the case for round 2 and 3 Showdown. So we have to get our leverage across the board, right? You can't just kind of like count on going to our 6K guys and going like, okay, I'm going to take 2 sub 5 percenters down there, because there are some sub 5 percenters in the 6K range, but they're still like 2 to 3, 4% owned, like your Brian Campbell's, the guys at the very, very, very bottom, and they're all like +7, +8, and they suck. Like it's like, it's not the same as a normal Showdown slate where we can go down to $6,700. We have some legit golfers because the pricing is normally softer for Showdown that are cheaper than they should be. Normally we're like 7K guys for main slate, but are now cheaper, that we can get at sub 5%. Like that's the nuts. That's why I love doing for rounds 2 and 3 Showdown, is getting to those sort of plays and using them to differentiate. We don't have that luxury here. So that's why and you don't even have to go like double pivot towards the top, but that's why I think there's so much utility on a player like a Xander or a Justin Thomas being mixed into a lineup, because it gives you that flexibility that you need. Like normally we can kind of bank on doing that further down the line. If you're not careful about it on a round 3 Showdown slate, like you're going to have a much higher chance of duplicating yourself with only 49 players to choose from. And also because that ownership is more condensed. So I just wanted to throw that PSA out there because building is at least a little bit more thoughtful in this kind of scenario. Let's go with a Ricky Fowler for some short game regression. Guy couldn't buy a putt for his life today, kind of to my detriment on the prop side of things, but he was hitting the ball beautifully. In fact, had one of the best iron days of anyone in the field. So let's throw him in there. Let's go with Siwoo Kim for a lot of the same reasons. He hasn't been able to buy a putt over his first 36 holes. Let's also throw in, a Harris English. I thought he was kind of looking decent stat-wise. Let's go Akshay Bhatia. I know we mentioned him as a decent ball striking candidate. And in this lineup here, our highest position is T12 with a Ricky Fowler, who I really think he's going to make more putts tomorrow. He was sniffing the hole. He was lipping out all day. I had his over 3 birdies, and I think he only made 2 out of the 18 holes. And both of them were like bombs from either way on, like 40 feet on the green or just off the green for a chip in. Tomorrow's going to be the day where he's hitting it to like the 10 to 15 feet and he's just draining them in. Or at least that's what I'm hoping for, right? That kind of a stat profile. So he's our highest owned player in this sort of lineup. I'm great with that. Like, it doesn't matter who we use as our last man in. It could be the chalkiest player on the slate. It could be a 30%er for all we know. And obviously, these guys that are at $7,000 aren't going to be like 30% owns. But even if they were, we would get away with that because we've gone pivot for 3 or 4 of our other spots. So that's kind of the beauty with getting different, getting a little bit ugly in spots. And this would be an extreme example of it. Me pretty much using a pivot in every spot except for Ricky Fowler. But even if you only went with like 2, maybe 3 pivots in your lineup overall, that's enough, right? It doesn't have to be overdone. So for example, up top, let's say if we didn't get those pivots into our lineup, maybe we started with an Aubert who's maybe a quote unquote safer play, and then maybe went Cantlay as well, who's got slightly better form than Justin Thomas. This kind of start would be a little bit more ownership with your first 2 players, but because we've got the Siwoo Kims, your Akshay Bhatias of the world, and as long as your last man in here isn't a mega chalky guy, you're probably okay. So you'd want to avoid a Maverick McNeely. He's going to be significantly higher owned than a lot of the other players around them. But let's say you dropped down to either a Day, a Lowry, or even left some salary on the table and went down to like a $6,900 Pendrith. I think that would make a lot of sense and you'd be okay with pretty much any of those players as your last man in. So it's just about balancing the ownership, especially for the contest you're entering. The bigger the contest, the more differentiation that you're going to need to make sure you don't duplicate yourself with other people that you're going against, and also to give yourself enough leverage in the contest to move up when your players have a good day. But that's all I've got, guys. We're going to cut it off there for the round 3 live stream. Best of luck with everything that you guys are going with. I hope to see a lot of your logos and a lot of your names towards the top end of those GPPs. For the prop and betting preview, I'll be doing that a little bit later on tonight on my YouTube channel. So make sure to subscribe to that so you guys can catch all of that. And for all of my projections, also all my modeling and player pool for tomorrow, you guys can find that on my Patreon page. To join that, you guys can find that on my X/Twitter. It's in my bio on there, GSLukeDFS. On there, I've got all my projections posted. So that's all, guys. Appreciate you guys as per usual. Best of luck, guys. I was saying before. I'll see you guys for the round 4 live streaming content tomorrow night.